Hello and welcome to this continuation of the While I'm At It saga. Today, since I'm in the middle of doing a handling upgrade on the front end of my car with suspension, might as well, while I'm at it, add disc brakes. So it just happens that we have this 1970 parts car in our yard that has the complete setup. So I'm going to start tearing off everything on this car, which I won't show you too much of because it's pretty self-explanatory, but then reconditioning the parts on this car to put them on mine. So let's get started. And here it all is. It took a little while to get it off that car, but finally here's all the stuff that I'll be needing to convert my 68 manual drum brake car to the 70 power disc brake system. Got the pedal, which is longer, and I think it's actually unique to 70 for some reason. Got the distribution block that has a built-in proportioning valve, so it's a simpler system than the earlier ones. And of course the booster and master cylinder, which again is unique to 70. And of course both spindles, which are heavier duty for 70, and rotors and calipers, which will need to be either replaced or rebuilt. But the 70 system is a good one to go to if you're not a purist trying to keep the 68 or whatever your year is system. It's simpler, it's stronger, it's heavier duty. It's all around a good setup, but it's important to make sure you keep all 70 stuff together. Also, you need the switch from the 70 disc brake pedal. Now, the 70 hanger you can't use because it won't fit for the brake pedal. Here is my manual drum brake 68 pedal hanger and my old pedal. Now what I need to do is modify my hanger so it looks more like this one, which is a 68 disc brake hanger. You notice there's holes up here. It's because the brake pedal is longer. I don't have them on the manual drum brake one, so I'll have to drill those holes in that location. Then also I'll have to get rid of these fittings in here. These three need to go away. See, like this one doesn't have them. However, you will want to leave that one because that's the one stud that the booster doesn't have. There's a bolt that goes through the firewall. As you can see, I've already got all my stuff out of the car, including the power steering stuff. And it's all sitting in a pile at the moment, but I'll have to sort of take it apart and salvage some of it and sort of Frankenstein together my disc brake system. Now I guess I need adapters for the tie rod ends because these 70 spindles are bigger or something like that, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. As you can see, the car is completely naked right now up front. I'm doing suspension at the same time, so this is a good time to do your brake conversion. I've got these reinforcing plates welded in. Check out our other suspension upgrade video to check that out. But one more thing I'll have to do is just drill out this hole right here. It's already there and sort of outlined, but I'll just have to open that up to fit the booster through. Okay, check this out. We're inside the car now. And I just noticed after fiddling around trying to fit the booster, check out this outline up here, up above that center hole. I'm thinking that's a template from the factory for where you would need to cut out to fit the booster. So I'm going to cut out that remaining upper section on that, and I think that'll work. Ah, perfect. like a glove. Here we go, one freshly resurfaced brake rotor. I'll probably clean up that rust and maybe throw some paint on it, but otherwise this is pretty much ready to put on the car. Okay, I've been spending some time cleaning up these parts, taking everything apart and painting things and resurfacing the rotor and sourcing the parts that I need. Now I'm getting ready to put everything on the car. Now I've done a suspension upgrade at the same time, so I've already got the spindle on the car, but the rest of this stuff is set to go. So one of the first things you need to do is put the dust shield on. So I've got a new gasket right here. Let's go do that. Okay, so first goes the gasket, which can go any direction. And then goes the shield itself, which of course goes like that, so there's space for the caliper. And then on top, you put this little plate, and this can only go one way. So if you get it wrong like that, the holes don't line up. But that would be the right way. I'm just going to reuse the original fasteners on this. Gotta draw the line somewhere, right? Okay, so next we want to put the rotor on, but before we do that we have to install the bearings. I've already done the races right here, and to do that properly you need a special tool, which is this kind of thing. You see how it's actually tapered to fit in there? And it fits that perfectly, and you hammer that down. So those are already in. Then I've got my brand new bearings, and what you want to do is pack these with wheel bearing grease before you do anything. Okay, in order to grease the bearings properly, we need to use hydraulic pressure. You can't just smear it in there with your fingers, that's not nearly enough. So, we need to actually use a special device such as this magical cone, which sandwiches the bearing in between these two cones, and then there's a grease fitting on top of this stem, and there's holes down below, and you use a grease gun to inject grease forcefully into the bearing, and it gets all into the rollers and everywhere, way more than you could do by hand. So I'll try and zoom in and see if you can see this work. I've just hooked up the grease gun, and we want to see grease ooze out of all those rollers. That's how we know we've got it nice and packed. So I'm giving it a few pumps here. See it starting. And now it's creeping around the rollers. Give it a couple more. Yeah, it's getting nice and full. Just gonna plop it out. There it is. That's what we want to see. Don't be shy with the grease. You want this thing completely filled. And now we just repeat the process with the larger one. Okay, now that that's done, we can install the larger rear bearing into the rotor. I'm just going to try to not touch it. Here we go. Nice. Look at all that grease. That's beautiful. And by the way, you see all this extra grease we have on here? Use that on the spindle on the car. You want to smear a whole bunch of grease on there before putting the rotor on. I'm just going to glob it on here. I should probably wear gloves, but whatever. Of course, this is wheel bearing grease. Okay, now don't forget the seal that goes behind this. Okay, now we can put the rotor on to the spindle. Just be aware if you've put the front bearing in that it's going to want to fall out, so you have to sort of hold it. Should probably put it in afterwards, actually. There we go, nice. Here's where we start putting this back together. First goes this washer that has a notch, so it only goes one way. And then this nut, I'll just wipe off a little bit of that. So a good rule of thumb is you take a wrench and it's 1 1/8. You tighten this nice and tight, make sure everything is seated, and then you back it off 1/4 turn. So right about there. And sure enough, spins easily, but when I try to move it back and forth, it doesn't budge. So now we're ready to put this retainer in place. You have to make sure you leave room for a cotter pin. You want to start where there's a slot for the head to go. Finally, we just cover it back up with the grease cap. There we go. Okay, before we mount the caliper to the spindle, we actually need to install these rubber insulators. So we're looking at the back side of the spindle now. They go towards the rotor this way. Okay. There we go. Okay, so now we set the caliper on here. And don't forget this back plate. Now if you want to be totally correct, this isn't supposed to be black, but I just painted it black because that's what I had laying around. And again, I'm just going to reuse the original hardware on the bottom. Okay, now when you buy a rebuilt caliper, it comes with some of the hardware, including the bolts you'll need for the top part. And I went ahead and put a little bit of grease on the end just to help slide it into that rubber. It's kind of hard to get in there sometimes. We need to now remove this whole assembly from the car. The reason I put the caliper on the stabilizer plate first is I thought it was easier in that position just because it's, you know, in a solid clamped place. And now all I have to do is remove this nut and that nut, and this whole plate comes off, and I'll do the pads over on the bench. Okay, here's the caliper off the car and the new pads ready to put on, and the clips that come with the rebuilt caliper. Okay, first of all, on these clips, you'll have to actually bend up this tab in order to get the pin through. So I'm just going to use a putty knife and bend those up. And then we've got these pins that go from the inside. You notice they have a little sort of nail head on them. Alright, when you're putting the clip on, it kind of helps to hold the pin from the other side, so I'm going to use this thing and just hold that, and then slide this over. There you go. And then you'll need to bend down that tab that you bent up earlier. Okay, so for the inner pad, it's got these two ears on it. You want to slide this in here and get those ears to sit on top of the flat portion there. And then you take these crazy clips and put the bottom part in this hole, and then the top holds that tab. I'm gonna go ahead and reuse my original bolts. Once you get it started, it's all downhill. Okay, and finally, back on the car it goes. Another thing to keep in mind is, you see how these bolts have holes in them? That's because there's supposed to be wire for safety going through and tying them off to the spindle. Let's look at a used example over here. See that wire that wraps around the spindle? That's so the bolt doesn't loosen by itself, and that's a good idea, so I'm going to do that on mine. Something to keep in mind when you're wrapping the wire around these bolts, do it in such a way that the bolt can't turn counterclockwise. Because see the way I did this one, if that wants to turn that way, this is going to stop it, it's going to become tighter. I realized it after doing this one, and I realize now that if this turns counterclockwise, this is just going to loosen, so it's not really going to do its job. So I'm going to redo that one. Well, this didn't work out quite as well as I had hoped. My hole drilling skills aren't quite up to par. You can sort of tell that's not exactly square. So what's going to happen is, if I try to put the pedal in there like that, it's going to be crooked. So either I have to try to repair this one, or chuck it and try to do another one, or either that, or call West Coast Classic Cougar and just get a disc brake pedal hanger. That might be easier, honestly. Okay, here's my revamped disc brake pedal hanger. I threw some black paint on it. It's not really supposed to be black, but that's okay. And got the pedal on and painted. Attached up top through those holes. I ended up using the original disc brake hanger that we had just because I messed up the one that I had, but maybe you'll have better luck. So, I'm going to go ahead and put this in the car. So there's two screws that hold the pedal hanger to the firewall, and you want to put that in first before the booster. Alright, now here's my rebuilt 1970 brake booster and new master cylinder. Now also you're going to need this adapter plate, and this is a reproduction. The only downside is I found that I had to enlarge these holes where the studs go through. They were a little too small on this reproduction part. Also I had to paint it black because it came in a gold cad finish. But anyways, it goes onto the brake booster like so. And you'll want to put the master cylinder on the booster first and then put the whole assembly in the car. It's easier that way. Also, don't forget the gasket. After you tighten this one bolt from the firewall side, you'll be ready to move inside the car and attach the rest of the nuts. Alright, here we are inside the car. You'll have 4 nuts to attach, 3 of which are on the brake pedal hanger. Finally, we're ready to attach the plunger from the booster to the brake pedal, and it just sandwiches in between the brake switch and these plastic washers, and then it's all held in place by a special clip. Distribution blocks. There's a couple options here, and again, since I'm using all 1970 stuff for my conversion, these are both 1970 blocks. This is the original one that I got off the parts car, and this is a brand new reproduction. Now, a lot of people have had perfectly fine success using original ones and just cleaning them up, inspecting the O-rings, and they continue to work. But I would feel a bit better using something that's new, especially when you're talking about brakes and O-rings that could fail. And in fact, moving forward in this video, you're going to see this one in the car. But what ends up happening is, since I'm filming this out of order, is I had rebuilt it with a O-ring kit that ended up failing, and I developed a leak out of this switch. So that's what made me decide to go with a brand new reproduction block. Something else I'd like to illustrate. This is the 68-69 distribution block and proportioning valve, and as you can see, the valve is separate whereas in 1970 and onward they integrated it into the block. So like I was saying earlier, this is a bit simpler, but also this mounts in the car horizontally, whereas the 1970 and onward mounts vertically like that. So that causes a couple of issues that we'll talk about shortly. There is also a third option. What this is a 1970 style block mounted onto a bracket like the earlier ones, so it can mount horizontally. And I'm not sure yet if your factory lines would line up to it, but that's just another way you could go.
Okay, now for brake lines, I went ahead and got the 1970 front steel brake line kit, and believe it or not, it actually seems to fit. I just sort of test fit everything for the time being. The distribution block actually goes into the original holes from my old drum brake one, and the lines seem to line up. So that's good news. The only thing I don't know at this point is the front to rear brake line that goes into that last port on the distribution block. I don't know if that's going to fit or not, but everything else is seeming to go as it should. Something else to think about when you're doing your brake lines, we do sell a complete correct hardware kit for the fuel and brake lines. It's all in one kit, and that comes with all the fasteners and clips and rubber grommets and everything you need to run your brake and fuel lines. So I'm getting this kit, and that'll help out a lot. One slight problem I'm going to run into is I can't use my stock plastic D-clip to hold the wiring and vacuum lines here. Reason being, it interferes with this brake line here, so that's not going to work. So I think what I'll try doing is replace that with one of these guys, which is a factory style fastener, and just wrap it around, and that should be the right size to fit in there. So that should look reasonably stock and still do the job. The other problem is the wire for the brake warning light. My stock one is not going to reach. See where the switch is down there? Yeah. So something is going to have to be done about that.
Alright, fast forward just to show the solution to this problem. What I did was I took another plug off of another harness and spliced it onto mine, and that gave me enough length to plug in to the brake warning switch. And what we do is we take wiring harnesses that have damage elsewhere and try and salvage all the good plugs off of them. So if you need this particular pigtail, as we call it, we have it available on our website. For the long brake line that goes to the rear brakes, I'm using the 68 brake line because it fits the car better for obvious reasons. The only problem is I'm going to have to bend the very end of it 90 degrees to go into the 1970 distribution block. And here's a finished shot with the brake line attached. Just make sure to take your time and use an actual tube bending tool so you don't kink the brake line. Alright, when you go to put on your new front flex hoses, you need these copper washers on either side of the special bolt that your brake fluid travels through. Now these washers have some ridges on them. These are the original ones that I've cleaned up a bit. And the reason for those ridges is, look at that. It seals it in those grooves. The new washers that you might get are smooth, and I'm not sure if maybe once you tighten them down, they might imprint the ridges on them. But I've just gone ahead and cleaned up the original ones as well as the original bolts. We do have these new, but I decided to save myself a little money, clean up the old ones. So let's go. If you have a drum brake car like I did, you'll need to tap out the front hole where the flex hose mounts. The hole's already there, it just doesn't have threads, so I'm using a 5/16 coarse thread tap, and there's no space in there, so 1/4 inch open end wrench does the job. Once you've gotten your flex hose attached to the car and your brake line attached to it, it's time to put this on the caliper. Moving over to the driver's side, I've already put this one on. Just wanted to show you from below how that looks installed.
Well, it's time to wrap up this video. It's actually taken a lot longer than I care to admit to wrap it up. Partly because I've been working on a lot of different areas on the car, and part of it's because I wanted to film a side-by-side driving test with a drum brake car and a disc brake car to show the difference in the stopping distance. That never happened, but what I do have is 2 different Motor Trend magazines from back in the day that did road tests on Cougars, and I found that the difference between a drum brake car and a disc brake car from 60 miles an hour is about 40 feet. That's a lot. So I'm really glad I put disc brakes on my car. You know, I don't want to crash into somebody's Kia when they slam their brakes on. Even though I'm doing a mostly original restoration, that was a no-brainer to me. And using Ford parts, you know, original equipment, I think is a good idea too, because they'll be serviceable and rebuildable into the future. Whereas some of the aftermarket kits that are out there for disc brake conversions, well, who knows, 20 years in if you're still going to be able to replace parts on those systems. But yeah, since the last segment you saw, I've got all the lines hooked up. You know, everything's been bled. I had some help with that. It's kind of a 2-person job, but I'm sure there's plenty of videos out there on how to bleed brakes. But yeah, long story short, great upgrade. Can't recommend it enough. And thanks for watching my video. Hope it helped.